It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning to you. An inveterate observer of people and places and a self-described documentary photographer, Nell Campbell has at the root of her practice a belief in social justice, a curiosity and delight in the idiosyncrasies of her fellow humans, and a warm, open nature. She describes her approach as bossy but not threatening, adding, "Mostly I tell people how great they're looking and not what they need to do." Born in Mississippi, she grew up in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and started out with an Instamatic camera given to her as a gift. Later, inspired by The Family of Man, a much celebrated photo book of the 1950s and 60s, Campbell realized that photography was what she wanted to do, though, as she put it, I had no idea what it meant. Nell moved to Santa Barbara in 1969 and studied at the Brooks Institute. She was a staff photographer for the United Farm Workers in the 1970s and has been included in exhibitions across California, including at this museum, as well as in her home state of Louisiana. Her photography has been the subject of an exhibition at the Channing Peak Gallery and the Community Arts Workshop, as well as at the AD&A Museum at UCSB. Her no-frills manner is accompanied by a sense of play and the absurd, and her work is noteworthy for its capacity to capture with equal insight the passion of a political demonstration, bizarrely comical roadside attractions, Mardi Gras parades, duck hunting blinds, and the stillness of an isolated bayou. She joins us this morning to talk about her work that is currently on view in a time of gifts, and to tell us more about how she got here. Please join me in giving a warm, warm welcome to Nell Campbell.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. And so, quite a few of you I know, so that's really nice. And the rest of you I can torture now. And I didn't write everything down, so these are just little reminders to myself. I want to thank Patsy Hicks, for that wonderful introduction and for inviting me to speak to you. It's an honor to stand on this stage. I've sat in this auditorium many times. And to Charlie Wiley, who couldn't be here this morning, who's the curator of photography and new media, who I'm sure you know. And to Patty Santiago, who helped me, endured my many technical questions about my slide presentation. And to Nick, I think is his name, who has me all wired up for sound. So can you hear me okay? Okay. What? If you say something to me, you have to say it loud because my ears don't work very good. So this is an early photo. I took this when I was 10. This is in Biloxi, Mississippi, and I took it with my Brownie Hawkeye. And I don't know, maybe it was a hand-me-down camera from my mom. I wasn't really a kid who photographed all the time, but I did periodically take photos. And because my family lived in the same house for 50-something years, my mom saved all these negatives, so I have them, which is kind of ironic. But that's my grandmother's truck. She worked in a shrimp canning factory, and that was actually probably belonged to the company, the Marver Shrimp Company. She drove the neighborhood women to work in the morning in the truck. And in the middle of the night, the whistle would blow, meaning they were shrimp, and the ships were coming in, the boats were coming in, and they went to work like at dawn. And so I'm not quite, and then there was a little store across the street where sometimes they would go and have drinks, and I would have a Coke. But so I'm attached to this photo because it's a long ago memory. I spent a lot of summers there. So this is what I feel like one of my first important photos to myself. This was in 1968. I had a 35 millimeter camera for about 3 months. And this is in my hometown of Lake Charles. And this is right after Martin Luther King was assassinated. And this is where people were lining up to go into the football stadium to have a memorial. And I remember going there, and I didn't stay very long because I felt like it wasn't really my place to be there, that might be intrusive. And I didn't print this photo until 2016. And then I looked at it again, and I decided it was a captured moment, you know. And like sometimes I wish I could take that good a photo now. But that was sort of the beginning of there are different kind of themes I've covered over the years that kind of happen by happenstance, or I start doing them and I just keep doing them. And so I photographed political demonstrations and events now since 1968. This is San Francisco, 1970. And it was a big anti-war march in San Francisco. A friend and I drove up and we slept in my van overnight and got there early in the morning. And this is a moment on the street. This is Santa Barbara, May 1970. I think this was after demonstrations all over the country after the Kent State killings. And I showed this, I had a show in 2016 at the Community Arts Workshop of political demonstrations that was up during the election. It was supposed to be a celebratory event, but it didn't work out to be celebratory in my mind. But there were people who showed up and saw themselves in this photo, which was what I was really hoping that people would appear, you know, would recognize themselves from this long ago time. So this is in Alameda Park. I worked for the United Farm Workers starting in not for a long time, about 9 months, from fall of 1976 till the spring of 1977. And those of you who lived in California then might remember that the UFW had a proposition on the ballot in 1976, and that's when Carter ran for president. And the proposition was to make the Agricultural Labor Relations Act into a law. And if it became a law, it had to be changed by a vote of the people. If it's an act, it can be changed by the legislature. And it was Jerry Brown had made the Agricultural Labor Relations Act happen. And so there was a lot of union organizing that went on in the fields. I spent the first few months traveling with Cesar Chavez going around encouraging people to vote yes on Proposition 14. And this is from down in the Imperial Valley, and where there's a big winter harvest. A lot of crops are grown in the Imperial Valley during the winter. And so these obviously this is early in the morning, and those are obviously two supporters of the UFW and campesinas. This is another supporter. This was near the Tejon Ranch. I lived at the UFW, had their headquarters in Keene, California, which was an old TB hospital. And Keene is probably still a one-store drug store, gas station town, and it's where we lived, where the administrative staff lived. This is Caesar's funeral in 1993 in Delano. And this is taken with a panorama photo. This was in April of 1993. I had just come back from Washington, D.C. the night before. I can't imagine having that much energy now. And drove to Delano the next morning. This is taken in Washington, D.C. in 1987 at a large gay march with hundreds of thousands of people. This is an organization called ACT UP. I don't know, some of you might remember. It stood for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. I had to look up the UP part this morning, I couldn't remember. But this was one of their slogans. They had great graphics and slogans. And Reagan was in office, and they were criticizing Reagan because he wasn't providing the drugs and the research and many things. And I don't know if ACT UP is still a viable organization, but they were very powerful, they were very theatrical. And this was sort of, in a way, might have been sort of their first public action with appearance, kind of. It was very exciting. This is, so I spent from 2016 election until now, until Biden took office, I spent most of my free time photographing demonstrations, the big Women's March in LA, and all the demonstrations that happened in Santa Barbara. And I think I photographed nearly every one of them except maybe one. And this was immediately a day or two after the election, after Trump's election. This is in De La Guerra Plaza. This is from the Women's March in LA in January 2017. So the other thing is, one of my other subjects has been Cuba. I went to Cuba first when I was a child. I was 7. And I went with my two of my aunts. One of my aunts was married, and my other aunt had a gentleman friend who was owned a gambling house in New Orleans. So it was, and we drove from Mississippi to Florida, and then we flew to Havana. So I was always had this kind of, and Havana is in many ways like New Orleans, and I spent a lot of my youth in New Orleans, and I went to college in New Orleans, so I have a long attachment to New Orleans and to Louisiana and Havana. I was walking in Havana one night, like in 2000, and I'm looking at I'm in this neighborhood called the Vedado, and the growth, the plants are just like the plants in New Orleans, and I felt like I could have been in New Orleans. So I've been to Cuba 5 times, including the time when I went when I was a child. And this was taken in 2000. It was in an old pharmacy in Old Havana. And what it says is, eternal glory to our martyrs. It's not religious martyrs, they mean revolutionary martyrs. And the next time I went in 2002, they were redoing this. What's the word I want? And then the next time I went, it had been redone, but they didn't put back the revolutionary slogans. They restored it as it had been originally. It was a very big building, actually. This is in Havana on the Malecon. This is a man who's been fishing. And I was in a rent-a-car with a guide who had taken me to the countryside, and we were going to return the car, and I saw this man, and I said, we have to stop. And he's like, well, I can't stop here, I'll get a ticket. So he went around the corner, and I ran back, and this man very patiently let me take his photograph numerous times. This is another fisherman in Havana. This is in 2005. People use, inner tubes to float in the water and to fish. This is also on the Malecon. That's an old soccer stadium. They were having a baseball game, an impromptu baseball game. This car, I didn't learn what this car was, and now I've forgotten, but ironically, so this is in 2002. In 1988, I was in Cuba, and I photographed a car, an old car, and it turns out it was in the same location as this car. It was the same building behind it. I mean, it was just happenstance. And I figured, well, wait, I've been there before. This is, I like to call this in God Created Chevy, but this is in 2002, and the first morning I was there, I have a Cuban friend who would walk with me around when I was taking photographs, and he had been a guide and had a car when our friend and I went in 2000, and so I went a couple of times after that, and I would always get together with him, and we were walking, and they were worried about dengue fever, so they'd been spraying malathion, I think it was malathion, out of what looks like a leaf blower on the street, and so we're always trying to avoid that. And then I looked in this garage, and I saw those beams of light, and I said, well, I have to photograph that. And the reason the beams were so strong was because they'd been just spraying insecticide in there, but all of a sudden I didn't really care anymore about insecticide. And I went back another day with a tripod, and there were beams of light, but they weren't accented like that. This is in an old bank that was kind of being used as a place they were restoring different buildings in Old Havana, and this is where the people who were working stored their tools and did work. And when we went in there, they took a friend and I in there, And I was standing in the front of it, and they started wiping it with, one of them started wiping it off, and I'm like, no, don't wipe it off. Don't clean it off. This is in Pinar del Rio, which is west of Havana. It's a big tobacco growing area. This is south of, near Trinidad, which is on the southern coast of Cuba, and it's a big sugarcane growing area. And this was taken with a panorama camera. A lot of these were taken with film. In fact, most of them were taken with film. But I spent a couple of days in Trinidad, and I spent a day driving, and it's called the Bao de los Ingenieros. Bao, I don't say it right, but it's the Valley of the Sugar Mills, and they're still growing sugarcane there, but they've cut a lot of sugarcane back. But we spent a day driving, and I would go out in the fields, and my guide said he wouldn't leave the car because he said things would be stolen off of it if he left the car. So I would trudge out in the fields and ask to take pictures. And at the end of the day, this is in Pinar del Rio. These are two brothers. And the interesting thing I learned about those hats is people paint their hats. Like these guys painted their hats blue. I have a photo of a man on a horse who he painted his hat silver. And so I realized that the hats were issued by the state. All the farm workers had them. In fact, I bought one from somebody. But these were two brothers. This is also, yes, it's in Pinar del Rio. And it was actually a billboard that on the other side, it was about recovering from a hurricane it had. It's a slogan about recovering from the hurricane, but I decided I liked it better with Fidel there. So I grew up in Louisiana, and I spent a lot of time in New Orleans as a child. My aunt lived in New Orleans, and I would go and stay with her, and I'd stay with my grandparents in Mississippi. And I went to school in New Orleans. I went to college in New Orleans at Newcomb, which is now part of Tulane. And so after hurricane, I should start with hurricanes. When you grow up in Louisiana, you can date a lot of your life by what happened, which hurricane happened in which year. And there was a really big hurricane when I was 11 in 1957 called Hurricane Audrey, in which 500 people were killed in a coastal town south of Lake Charles because we didn't have weather satellites in 1957. And so they predicted the hurricane was going to come late the next afternoon. And I remember being in our yard the afternoon before, and the light was kind of green. And I recently read that that's not unusual. I didn't imagine it, you know. And then when we woke up the next morning, the hurricane was there in full force. And so the people on the coast mostly hadn't evacuated the day before because they thought they would have the morning to evacuate. So a lot of people were trapped. And there was a pontoon bridge that you had to cross. It's south of Lake Charles is mostly marsh, some prairie, but mostly marsh and wetlands. And so people were trapped. The pontoon bridge blew out. And so so I'm familiar with hurricanes. And after Hurricane Katrina, some friends and I did a fundraiser here. And then 3 weeks later, I think it was 3 weeks or a month later, was Hurricane Rita, which affected my hometown of Lake Charles, which was actually a bigger storm than Katrina. But Katrina affected New Orleans and the Mississippi Gulf Coast. So I felt like where I had grown up I sort of felt like, well, maybe this is what it feels like to be in exile because, I didn't know what was happening I didn't know, at one point we didn't know where my cousin was, and we couldn't figure out what was going on between Katrina and Rita because, New Orleans had water in it for 80% of the city had water for 6 weeks. And it was hard to get information. And actually, Mercedes Eichholz and I would meet at the Paradise, and we would exchange because she was from Louisiana originally, and she had connections in Louisiana. We would meet and eat dinner and talk about, what we had found out about what was going on. So I decided that I needed to go back, and I needed to witness it, and I needed to be there, see my family and see my friends and see what was happening. So I went at the end of October, and I didn't fly to New Orleans because I didn't want to I couldn't picture being in the airport. It was cheaper to fly to New Orleans, but I couldn't picture going in the airport where I'd seen old ladies sitting on baggage carousels awaiting, to be rescued. So I flew to Lake Charles, or flew to Houston, and then I got a car and drove to Lake Charles, which is like 130 miles. And when I got off the interstate, I didn't recognize where I was, which I knew my whole life, because the tree cover was so different. The trees were gone, so many trees were gone. And so I went to New Orleans the beginning of November, and for a couple of days I couldn't really hardly bear to do anything. And so I spent a lot of time. This is in City Park, and this is a decoration that normally floats in the water in City Park. I don't know they're not lakes in City Park, but they're little bodies of water, and they put decorations in them at Christmas, and you can drive through the oaks, and they light the oak trees, and you can drive through. So this is one of the holiday decorations of City Park that had washed up after the storm. And so I photographed this for a couple of days because I couldn't bear to do anything else. And then I made about 4 or 5 trips to Louisiana in 2005, 2006. And I was there for the first Mardi Gras after Hurricane Katrina. And one of the things I did was this is a float builder, a man named Louis Massett. And he was one of the smaller float builders probably. And I went to his place and asked if I could photograph, and he told me that I could. And so he wasn't completely flooded. He had a couple of feet of water. And so he just pushed everything aside. These were things from previous years, and just pushed everything aside. And all his tractors had been stolen, and all his tools had been stolen. And so this is and when I took this, I thought, I don't really like that blue dog. It's kind of a famous thing that George Rodrigue painted. And although George Rodrigue did a lot of great things after Mardi Gras to raise money with his paintings for people. So then a friend of mine I was printing in a darkroom, and a friend of mine said, you have to print that. And I think he was right. So that was the float builders down after the hurricane. And this was also taken at that same float builder. And the sides were off the buildings, they had blown off the building. And there was a lot of recycling of floats. You'd see floats in different parades, same floats in different parades, which is not usually the case. And also, this is the Lower Ninth Ward, which maybe you heard a lot about, which was, geographically, the directions are confusing there because of the way the city's laid out. But the Lower Ninth Ward is an old African-American neighborhood where a lot of people own their homes. And it was where the levee broke, which was really more like a wall, and was flooded. And that happened the day after the hurricane. We thought the morning after the hurricane, we thought everything was okay, that we kind of made it. And then they found out that everything was flooding. And so they weren't allowed back in their neighborhood. So the storm was in late August. They weren't allowed back in the Lower Ninth Ward until December or January to see what was going on. This is in March, right after the first Mardi Gras. And they were protesting, to get help for their neighborhood, and that they wanted to rebuild. And this was there was a congressional delegation in town to see the damage, and they were here this day. And the demonstrators, there's another one too, another group of people. So they're in one spot, and the bus is over by where the congressional delegation is, over by where the levee break was. And you can see them, and then some of the delegation starts walking over, and it's Lois Capps, and it's the governor of Louisiana. And Lois and I look at each other because we know each other from my taking her picture, and she's like, "What are you doing here?" But it really was it was a very tearful moment. I was really proud that Lois was part of the delegation. Not everybody from the delegation walked over, but Lois walked over, and they talked to the people who were demonstrating. This was So this is the lower Ninth Ward. This is in June. So the storm was in August 2005. This is June 2006. And there's hardly anybody around. And where there was a heat wave, it was 103. And so I would get up at 6:30 and go down there before it got hot. And I'm there one morning and I hear a chicken. I hear chickens and I'm like, what? It was kind of unnerving. And then I realized that there was somebody living in the house that was behind me where I was taking photos. But so this is like June, and people had, this was obviously something they had put up at Christmas. This is also in June of 2006. So then that leads to the photo that's in the exhibit, the current photo exhibit. I've forgotten the name of the exhibition, but it's up now. So this is, I've spent a lot of time in the marsh south of where I grew up in Lake Charles. And there's this one road that I like to go on a lot. It's called Little Chenier Road. And a chenier is a built-up thing in the marsh that's evolved over thousands of years. The base is probably shells. And if you look out across the marsh, like if you look out over there, faintly you can see what are oak trees. That's another chenier called Grand Chenier. And it's more on the coast, so we're not very far from the Gulf Coast, from the actual Gulf of Mexico. And so this road is 13 miles. It goes out into the marsh. It dead ends in the marsh. And there are lots of some people live on it full time. Some people have like little hunting, fishing camps that they go to. And there is one now I don't know now, but there was one large, fancy kind of hunting camp that was built since 2005 when the hurricane happened. But Lake Charles had 2 hurricanes in 2020 within a short time of each other, about within a month of each other. And so I haven't been there in 5 years. I'm going in a couple of weeks, so I don't know what Little Chenier Road looks like anymore. But this was taken in 2004 with a panorama camera. And this is this is in the marsh south of Lake Charles, not on Little Chenier Road, but near there, after Hurricane Rita in 2005. And a friend of mine got me permission from the head of it's in Calcasieu, it's in Cameron Parish, and it's very sparsely populated normally. It's not, and even less populated now, but most of the people originally were Cajuns who fished and hunted for a living, and then later people worked in oil wells, and some people found oil on their property and became wealthy. But my mom, these shrimp trucks would come to the malls in Lake Charles outside the grocery store. My mom was always buying shrimp off the shrimp truck. And a friend and I were down. I'd been given permission to go enter the parish by the head of the police jury. The police jury is like the county board of supervisors. I don't know why it has that name, police jury, but it does. And so I had permission to come and go, but I had to leave before it got dark. And we're leaving, our friends with me, and we're leaving because it's getting to be sunset, and we have to get out. And then I see this place where there are like 4 or 5 shrimp trucks, and I said, well, no, we have to stop, because I felt like I had to see the shrimp. I had to photograph the shrimp trucks. And this is just a scene in the marsh, and there were things like, there was an 18-foot tidal surge that came in. They thought it was going to come all the way into Interstate 10, which would have been about 30 miles. It fortunately didn't go that far, but it went, I don't know, it went about maybe 10 miles in. And so there were things like this. There's a piece of crochet hanging on there. I guess there's a pointer here, I don't know. There, that's a piece of crochet that's hanging on the tree. So it's very poignant to be there. And so this is the boat that's the photograph that's on exhibit upstairs. And this was in 2012. So this boat washed up in 2005, and it was still there in 2012. And I tried to look, I don't know if I actually photographed it in 2005, but But I photographed it in 2017 when I was last there. It was still there. And I doubt it'll be there this time when I go. I think it'll be gone. But so this is on Little Chenier Road. And this is what Little Chenier Road looked like 5 years ago. I mean, parts of it. It's a 2-lane road. Some of it's not paved. These are palmetto plants and lots of Spanish moss. And it's very peaceful. And when I'm there, getting out of my car taking pictures, invariably somebody stops and wants to know if I'm okay. Because you feel like you're in the middle of nowhere, and you kind of are, but not completely. So this is from Mardi Gras 1982. And these guys, we called them the Geisha Girls. It's probably not correct in this time, but they were a group of guys who got together at Mardi Gras, and one of them had been a circus clown. So he did their white face makeup. And it was very delicate. You can't really tell that from the photo. But so in 1982, they were staying next door to a friend of mine, and so I followed them around for all day because they were so colorful. And this was like the last picture of the day. Before it was getting dark. This is like slide film, something that I learned this week. It's actually still made, but it's very expensive now. And so at this time, this is like 1982, and I'm thinking maybe I'm not going to be a photographer. I was working at the post office. I was a postal worker, and I'm thinking, I don't know, maybe I'm not going to be a photographer. And then I took this photo, and then I decided, no, I like this photo, so I am going to be a photographer. I'm still going to be a photographer. And during the 80s, I made postcards with a friend. We produced like postcards. And then I figured out it would be better to go photograph a wedding on a Saturday than make postcards and sell them. But I sold cards when I would go to New Orleans. I would sell them to shops and things. And one of these, let me go back a second. One of these people, I'm trying to remember which one it was. One of these guys wrote me and told me, and said, hey, that's us, the guys in the jeans. And so I sent him some cards, but he also told me the sad news that this guy had died. And so it's kind of, I don't know, it's very poignant, the things that happen that people find you out of. I mean, I had my address on it, but that you find out about people that you took photos that you think you'll never see again, So this is 1991 at Mardi Gras. This was actually shown in a museum. I forget what the show was here. And maybe it was in a catalog the museum did of that show. This is Mardi Gras. It's weird. It looks like it's crop funny, huh? This is Mardi Gras, the first Mardi Gras after Hurricane Katrina. And I had a great apartment that somebody lent me in New Orleans, in the French Quarter, that I could stay in for, and a friend and I went. And it was a great time to be there because everybody was really, there had been a big debate about whether they should have Mardi Gras, whether it was right to have Mardi Gras after all these people died and all this destruction. And people said, no, we need something to, feel good about. And so they had Mardi Gras. And it wasn't so crowded. It was really kind of, it was mostly local people. Tourists weren't really back yet. It was a good time to be there, actually. So this is a Mardi Gras Indian. I don't know if you know about Mardi Gras Indians. They're not really Indians. They're African-American people who dress as Indians, and it's a long tradition. And they make these outfits, these incredible outfits. They make a new outfit every year. And they're different tribes. They have different tribes. Some of the Neville brothers who were singers were in a Mardi Gras tribe called the Wild Chapatoulas. And Chapatoulas is the name of a street in New Orleans. And so they basically march two times a year. They march at Mardi Gras, and then they march in March for St. Joseph's Day. So this is one of the Mardi Gras Indians on St. Joseph's Day, around St. Joseph's Day. This is like in 2004. So that's a lot of bead work. If you saw, there was a TV series called Treme that came out after Hurricane. The Mardi Gras Indians were featured a lot in that TV series. It was a great series, actually. This is that same Mardi Gras. This is there's a crew called Zulu. Zulu's an African-American crew that's over 100 years old, and they wear blackface. And one year when I was there for Mardi Gras, the friends who were the geisha guys and the guy who was the clown who did the whiteface, we got up at 3 o'clock in the morning and went to a hotel, and he did the blackface for Zulu people who were going to be in the parade. This is actually the Zulu parade in Mardi Gras 2006. And this is on Jackson Avenue. This is also taken with a panorama camera. And then this is Fiesta in Santa Barbara in 1989 in Casablanca, also taken with a panorama camera. So now we change gears. Some friends on a camping trip discovered this place called the Exotic World out in the desert near, it was near Hellendale. I'm trying to remember what the name of the bigger town was. And it was a / burlesque museum. And really, it was an old kind of tract house with another building where a lot of the artifacts were, and it was run by a woman named Dixie Evans, who had been a burlesque dancer, and she was a lookalike for Marilyn Monroe during the Marilyn Monroe days. And she didn't start it, another dancer started it who had died, but Dixie ran it, and they had a reunion and pageant once a year, and so we started going. I went about 3 times. My friend Bob Debris went every year, and he still goes. They moved to Las Vegas, and he goes to Las Vegas every year. But the pageant was outdoors, and gradually, it was a lot of older burlesque dancers who'd been, during the heyday of burlesque, and then a lot of younger people got into burlesque. I don't know if that's still true, but they were younger people. And there was a contest, and this woman, I don't know her real name, she called herself Miss Erochica, and she was from Japan. And she won the title of Miss Exotic World on this year. And the museum, that's the other thing. I was supposed to point out to you the photos that were in the museum, that the museum owns. The museum owns this photo, has this photo in their collection. They have the Chevy and with the light beams in their collection. And here's another burlesque dancer, both of these were young. And some friends and I did an exhibit here called Heavenly Bodies, photos that we'd taken at Exotic World. And Dixie Evans came, and we had a big cake with Dixie's picture on it. It was fun. It was great. So you can see it's out in the thing that I liked about it was all outdoors. So I've also done roadside things, and this is on Highway 395. I think it's near Olancha. I don't know if it's still there. This is like 96 or 2000. This is in Marfa, Texas. This is from 1996. And I've seen pictures of it in the last couple of years where it's been graffitied. And it was still a motel at the time that I took this photo, a functioning motel. And that's where Giant was filmed with Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson and James Dean. It was in Marfa. So this is another project that I didn't know was going to be a project. When I visit Lake Charles, these friends, this good friend that I grew up with who was a retired school teacher, and her husband, also a retired school teacher, would take me on boat rides. And I spent time on these waterways when I was growing up because I used to water ski. I water skied. And so they would take me out to, for boat rides and to my old haunts. And then one time I was there in 2001, they're like, well, there are all these duck blinds, these handmade duck blinds. We want to show you these. And so this was the first summer, this is June 2001, and this is also a panorama photo. And that's a duck blind in a place called Berry Bay. And so there are all these, it's along a river, the Calcasieu River, that runs from the Gulf into north. I don't know how far north it goes. It goes north of Lake Charles. I don't know how far. It gets kind of narrower and narrower as it goes up. But and there are bays and bayous that run off of the river, and hunters build blinds, and they use a lot of native materials like moss and palmetto leaves. They use some manufactured things, and so they're all different. And so I started photographing them, and I did a show here at the Jane Deering Gallery in 2011 of them. This is Berry Bay. This is December 2001. And so, this is the same blind a couple of years later in the summertime. And this blind, I don't know if it's there now, but it was still there. Well, part of it was still there. So there are about 3 of them I photographed over the entire project, and they don't have to take them down. In some parts of the state, apparently, they have to take the blinds down, but maybe because it's where these are is not a major waterway. You know, it's narrower, and so you can't build them in the middle, or some of them are, but they don't have to take them down at the end of the season. So they'll leave them, and sometimes they'll come back the next year. Their hunters will come back, and they'll do what's called rebrushing. They'll redo the camouflage on them. And there are instances of this one, Jane Deering and I call this Aretha's hat, because it reminded us of the hat that Aretha wore to Obama's inauguration. This is when it's in a place called Dan's Bay. So you see all the moss, and those dry brown leaves are palmetto leaves. This is the same blind in the summertime. And some of the blinds now, when I was there last, they're just like part of the frame is still there. Like Berry Bay is like a couple of 2x4s. You know, it hasn't been used in a long time. And I would spend time at it was called White Oak, and it was a boat launching place on the river. And so when I first got there in 2011, when I decided I wanted to keep doing this, I would go, and I knew that some of the hunters left from this boat dock, and so I would wait for them to come back, because they go out at the crack of dawn, and then they come in, you know, anywhere between 8 and 10 in the morning, they come back. And so I'd just hang out and, you know, ask them if I could take their photograph. And the UCSB Museum has this in their collection. This is a very elaborate 2-story, and like you put your boat behind here, you store your boat here. And there's some blinds where they build like a little shelter from a boat, and you put your boat in, and you shoot from the boat directly. You're not in a blind. This is the same blind as this one, but a couple of years later. This is in a place called Watermelon Bay. And my niece's husband and this is that same blind. This is 2017. So my niece's husband takes me out to photograph the blinds, and we're sitting by a blind one day, and it smells like we keep smelling mothballs, and there's a boat coming, and we're going, why does it smell like mothballs? And then he remembered that sometimes they put mothballs in them to keep the spiders and snakes out. It's a very strong smell. I don't know how I'm doing time-wise. So this is also the Watermelon Bay blind. This is the blind, I forget where this one is, but you can see they're like shotgun shells left in the bottom of the blind. It's probably hard to see from here, but. And this actually has some camouflage material on it. So everything's not man-made. So this is the last photo. This is from This is a composite that I made after the debris flow, well, a year after the debris flow. Somebody hired me to photograph the demolition of their house that was off of East Valley, not in the Randall area, but off of Sycamore Canyon. And so he hired me to photograph the house before it was demolished, and then to photograph the demolition of the house. And when he and I were walking around, I was noticing these footprints that were dried in the mud. They had leaves and things in them. And so I photographed them. And then another friend who had a house that was completely gone, up off of Ashley, there were a lot of footprints there, so I went and photographed those. And then those were the ones I ended up using, but I had made a couple of composites before I'd made a composite from a gay march in Washington with these two men were standing on a mound of political signs saying, "Stop end the military ban." And so I took this picture of them, it was film, I did like a whole roll of them, and then I made it into like a 30 by 40 proof sheet. And I did something like that in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina because I wanted people to be able to see what it was like to be there. So I dedicated one camera, and for like a couple of days, I just added a frame so you'd have a sense of what it felt like to see all that destruction. And I made a big proof sheet out of it. And so I did this too, but this was digital. I shot it with film originally, and then I went and shot it all digitally, and we put it together and made this big proof sheet. And it was in an exhibit at Westmont. It was a traveling exhibit, but she added a local component to it. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. I think maybe you get to ask questions. So does anybody have a question? You have to talk loud because I don't hear well.
Sure. In the case of these, the composites, do you said proof sheet. Can you talk just a bit about what you do? Is this a picture of a picture of pictures?
No, what we did was we scanned all these negatives, and then I can't do it. This friend of mine who used to do some work for me put it together. But in the previous ones that I shot with film, I took the first one to an aerial printer. There used to be an aerial photo place on Salinas Street, and they had different kind of equipment. In fact, I worked there for a couple of days once. And they scanned the strips of negatives and then put them together. And then I don't know exactly how it worked, but the first one was pre all the digital things. And so that's why I went to the aerial place. And then the one from after the hurricane was, there were still negatives, but we scanned them all digitally. And then made it like a giant proof sheet, because normally you'd make a proof sheet when I was using film. You put the paper, you put the negatives in a contact printer and put the paper in there and expose it, and then you'd run the paper through the color processing machine. Well, we just did it big. We made it really big and did it digitally and printed it like 30 by 40. And so, but these were, since it wasn't film, we just scanned the individual frames, and then I made prints of them and laid them out how I thought they should go. Does that tell you what you want to know?
Yeah, thanks.
Anybody else?
Why did you decide to become a photographer? You're really good at it, but why did you?
Why did I? Well, I sort of wonder that myself, but I think the defining moment for me was when I saw the book Family of Man. Are you familiar with it? That was from 1955, and I saw it in like 1966 or 67. And I thought, wow, that's what I'd like to do. I didn't really realize what I was saying, but I thought, that's what I want to do. And it's all kind of, it's kind of a miracle and not a miracle in a way, I guess. But I didn't have a 35 millimeter camera then. I had and mostly I took snapshots of my friends and things, and I took some pictures with that Brownie Hawkeye I had when I was growing up. kind of, but I realized also and looking back on it now, I realized that I looked at photographs a lot when I was a kid. I mean, like snapshots, the photos we had. I didn't have any photo books per se. But I collected postcards. I still collect postcards. I have boxes and boxes of postcards. And that I was looking at images a lot. And and then finally I went to Europe in '67 and I met this guy and he had a camera and when I came home, I thought, well, I want to learn how to use a 35 millimeter camera. So I went back to school in Lake Charles, and they didn't have classes in photography very much in that time. This is like '68. And I went to the school photographer for the college. And so he taught me how to use a 35 and showed me how to process film and how to use an enlarger. And he said, you should go to photography school. And so that, I don't know, I could go on, but that's enough. Yes.
Probably a silly question, but when you were photographing the duck blinds, were you on the bank or were you in a boat?
Oh, I left that out. I was in a boat. It's all from a boat. And right now, recently, well, my friends, one of my two original friends that took me, one of them has since died. And her husband we're all older now, so I don't think he can't take me out in the boat. But one of my nieces married an avid Louisiana fisherman, and he has taken me for, I don't know, the last 10 years or so out to photograph the duck blinds. And it's great because he really knows all the waterways and everything. And because you have to position the boat, and that, it's a challenge, but it's fun. But it's all from a boat. They're all from a boat. Sorry, I should have told you that. Anybody else? Yep, Pima?
Thanks, Nell. Two questions that are kind of together. On that Cesar Chavez funeral line, you said you did a panoramic.
Uh-huh.
Did you have an actual panoramic, or did you?
No, I have two panoramic cameras. Well, actually, I have three.
New back then, though.
Yeah, they're both 35 millimeter, and the film, it's 35 millimeter film, and it's a rotating lens. The lens rotates, and it shoots like say, pretend this is about the size of a regular 35 negative. It's like a negative and a half in a way. And so instead of getting like 36 pictures off a roll, you get like 20 or something. And the lens rotates around, and it gives a different feeling. It's about 140 degrees. And it gives a different feeling than if you were to do it by stitching them together. I don't know how to stitch them together. I haven't learned that. I should learn that.
Yeah, it's kind of hard, and you had to, because I've done that, and you have to change the coloration, because even though you're looking at, say, the sky, and it looks blended, when you have it stitched up like that, it doesn't work. And that's the second part of my question is, did you do a, I don't know, I don't have that term, I'm not a photographer, but did you do a coloration adjustment on this? Because didn't you say you did this from two different sites, that some of those photos?
Well, these are all from one site, actually. I ended up not using any from the first
But
site.
the colors, I mean, it's so consistent and beautiful. And,
Well, I don't really remember. I mean,
okay.
when I deal with, I used to print my own color negatives when I printed color negatives and with Type C printing, because there was a rental darkroom, and so I printed my own negatives. But I haven't learned to print my own negatives digitally, which is kind of silly that I haven't, but I haven't. And so I had a guy that I worked with for a few years, and then he became a mailman. But he did all my scanning and printing, because a lot of these are negatives that I've had scanned, which in some ways I like. You have a negative, and then you scan it. It's kind of the best of both worlds. You shoot it with film, and then you scan it. But I shoot a lot of things digitally now, because film's way too expensive now. So does that answer the question? So, I guess where I was going with that is that you can do so much in a computer now, and I like for it to really reflect what it really looks like. And because I had printed my own color, I have a sense of color, photographic color. And people, tend to saturate the color and do all this stuff to it. I don't really like that. It's not really what I want to do. So It took me a while to learn. I'd be like, something's wrong with this. You're not doing this right. What are you doing? And I said, it's too green. Well, really, it was too saturated, you know.
Well, thank you for your authenticity.
So, anybody else? Well, thank you. Thank you very much.